First of all, I'd also love to welcome you folks to this Sandbox Summit. This is the inaugural Sandbox Summit for us at PlayScience to be a part of the experience, and it has been a great learning experience in many, many levels, and thanks to Wendy, who's just been fantastic putting it all together. Right? So, in your programs it says Alison, Bryant, and Paul Levine, we are the yin and the yang of PlayScience, and I kicked the yang out because I said, we don't have enough time, you can't talk, let me talk, right? So Paul is up there standing and sending me hand signals if I'm going too long, et cetera, et cetera. So he's definitely part of this, but we thought it'd be a little easier and streamlined to sort of, because we're gonna cut down the time a little bit since we're now running a little bit late, so that only I would talk. So at PlayScience, as Wendy mentioned, we're an innovation development company, and we really focus all on play and learning across all platforms, toys, media, playgrounds, sort of open sandbox kinds of play, and really trying to understand how is it that kids learn, and how can we use that understanding to create better products for kids. Now, one of the things that we have sort of conceptualized to help us through this, whether it's doing research or it's doing product development or it's doing instructional design, is to really think of what we call the play matrix. And for us, the play matrix is a way to conceptualize all of the different key variables that go into creating products or services for kids and families that have learning aspects to it. So it includes things like who's your audience, what's your platform, what's your form factor, which is different from platform, right? Because just because you're on a tablet, a video is a very different experience from a game on a tablet, right? So it's a form of the content you're developing. What is that content? What's the context that you're playing in? Are you playing, by yourself? Are you playing with a sibling? Are you playing with a parent? All of those things make a difference when you're developing. Pedagogy, right? So what is it that you're trying to teach? Is there a particular method that you have? So when we're either doing our own research agenda, which today you're going to see one piece of sort of part of this, or we're helping somebody develop something, we really think about this play matrix, and most importantly, we think about the intersection of these things, right? So, okay, I'm developing this. I know that this is my curriculum goal. I know that this is the platform I have to work with. Okay, now what do I have to think about for form factor? What are all of my options? And then we sort of break things down and rebuild them using the play matrix. So this particular research project, we were interested in understanding as we have all this array of technologies and families today. Let's just take it back to a platform question. What are parents' perceptions of platforms? Do they have different perceptions of platforms? Meaning, do they put different kinds of values? Is there more educational value of one platform or another? Do they make different choices depending on if they have a boy or a girl, which you'll see have some interesting findings there? When and why do they use the device? So we really hit a lot, although we were focusing on platform, we hit a lot of those different aspects of the play matrix, looking at things like what's the context of the play, right? Who is the audience that you're focused on? Now we were specifically looking at families with children ages 2 to 9. And so this is a national survey with about 500 respondents. So what I'm going to do today is a very quick highlights of the findings of this. There's a lot of data here. I want to give you guys some idea of some of the more interesting things. So before I get to sort of our 4 key findings, I want to give you just the very brief overview of what we found. And so you'll see it's broken down by age group, because of course, very important from an audience perspective, the age you're talking about. And just to give you one context, the sideways tablet, if you couldn't tell from the slides before, that's a child tablet, right? Something like a Elite Pad or something like that, versus when it's horizontal, that's a regular tablet. So we wanted to split those out because we knew, based on other research that we'd done, that there is a difference in the way that parents and kids play and use those, particularly as you move, obviously, across ages. So what you see is that, first of all, tablets, by far and away reign supreme. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But it certainly changes over ages. And when you see a little bit of color, it's just we're sort of showing things that sort of move around based off of you're talking about the child's perspective or the parent's perspective. And again, I'm going to dive into this, and we're actually releasing this with press today, so you'll be able to get a little bit more access to data here. But let me dive down now into the 4 key findings that we're going to talk about. That not all mobile is created equal, the education rules, that we have pink versus blue tech, which is interesting, and that for family time, we're still very much talking about big screens. So the first thing is that not all mobile is created equal. I don't know if you noticed when I quickly showed you that earlier, but this is sort of the breakdown, just pulling out the mobile devices. So again, tablets and kids' tablets, sort of reign supreme. The biggest thing here is look at tablets versus smartphones, where tablets are way at the top. Literally, smartphones are at the bottom of the heap when it comes to parent and child preferences for what they want to play across contexts, right? Whether it's an educational context or it's just sort of a playful gaming context. So you have something where, you're kind of talking about the size of a screen and maybe, let's say, phone access, right? Those are sort of the two key things you're talking about. But a really difference in perception. So if you're developing, right, and you're asking yourself the question, well, I don't know, maybe we'll just go with smartphones, right? Or maybe we'll go with tablets, or maybe we'll just develop for both. Thinking about, well, there's a real preference here for tablets, right? The other thing here is that there's a real tablet tipping point as well. So right here, you have a huge differentiation between 2 to 4-year-olds. When you move to the 5 to 7-year-old, right, you have children's tablets really, decreasing the preference for those for both parents and kids. But more importantly, you see that the kids suddenly leap up and they're like, give me the regular tablet, right? What's interesting too, and we'll show you, we'll show you in just a second some of the larger data, but parents still love those kids' tablets. We're talking about still with the 8 to 9-year-olds. The kids are like, right? But the parents are, oh, but this is great. Give me the regular tablet, right? So there's a big change there. And again, smartphones sort of at the bottom. They'd rather use e-readers than smartphones, right? The other thing here is, again, you're talking about, it's a matter of differentiation of screen size, ownership to a certain extent, right? Because smartphones tend to be owned by the parents when you're talking about especially the 2 to 9-year-olds. But you have distinct and very different perceptions, right? And it could be the same content, right? So tablets are much more likely to be considered educational and good and useful. Smartphones, not educational, not safe, not good, right? So a real differentiation again, which was surprising to us. Now, the second key thing that we found is that no matter what the platform, education or the potential for education on the platform is the number one thing that parents are really interested in. So we had an open-ended question here about what you prefer, why do you prefer your child spend time on a specific device? So this is actually a quick semantic analysis, open-ended, of the words that parents used, right, to describe why they would prefer their child to use a device. And you see, educational and learn, far and away were the things that came up. Again, it didn't matter what the device was. That was the thing that came up first. And then you have things like age appropriateness. Games is sort of smaller, easy to use, and age appropriateness kind of go together in like a child-friendly, right? This was built for kids kind of perspective. So education is number one. And then for those of you who have your binoculars in the back to see this, we looked at, so the second one, which you kind of highlighted a little in red, is what they perceive to be most educational. So you see here, 42% are saying that tablets are the most educational. Obviously, kids' tablets rose to the top, 63%. Kids' tablets, that's the red line. I just love it. I think that's pretty fantastic. But tablets do very, very well until you get to things like best for using for the whole family, which I'll talk about at the end on the fourth point. And best for engaging other kids also does very well for television, for example, right? But education, we're talking about game consoles, 1%, they don't do so well on the education one, right? And let's see, and computers do very well for education as well. Video games, smartphones don't really have the education thing. Now what's interesting is, and I'm stepping slight side from this current research project because we have another research report that's coming out in a couple of weeks where we've been looking and deep diving into video services, OTT and SVOD, to really look at the landscape of like Netflix and Amazon and Hulu and who's using what and how does that work. And what we found there is, interestingly, education popped up. We were analyzing the data at the same time, right? Education popped up there as well. So that even, it's not just platforms, when we start talking about services, education comes out. So, in this particular case, you're talking about educational content or filters coming at the top of important features of video services. So whether it's educational content, like the videos that my kids have access to, or it's do you have a filter for education, right? That you can choose, I'm interested in my child learning about math or caregiving or something like that. So it's not just platforms, but certainly services where it comes up. The third big learning, and this is the one that I think was probably certainly well, we'll just say interesting. I mean, I really am fascinated by this, is that parents have incredibly different attitudes about technology when it comes to the gender of their child. Not the parent's gender necessarily, but the gender of their child. So for example, they're much more likely to look at child friendliness, right? So is it safe? Is it easy to use when they're choosing media for their girls? They're much more likely to use the child's preference when the media is being chosen for their boys, right? So they have a differentiation of values. So for the girls, it was child friendliness was 30% for girls, it was 17% for boys, right? So a big difference in the choices that how they're making their choices. They also, which is very aligned with this, are more likely, for example, to choose a child tablet for their girls than their boys, right? Which aligns with the idea that they're looking for something that's more child-friendly, and they're much more likely to, in fact, 3 times more likely to favor a smartphone or video game for their son, right? And again, that's because it's also aligned with the preference of what their child is wanting. So we have some differences there. Now, the next piece is also interesting, which is that parents are more likely to use technology and media to manage their boys, right? So when we think about those really tough times as a parent, putting your child to bed, soothing my child because they're upset, they are much more likely to be using media to do that with boys than they are with girls. So for us, these things around gender, it's an interesting sort of call to parents to really think about the choices, be a little bit more proactive in our understanding of how we're making those choices, and does that need to be the way that it is? Is there a reason why? They also, by the way, are more likely to. This was a whole battery of questions, and they all were sort of even, with the exception of these. So they're also more likely to turn to media and technology if they want their kids to learn for boys, right? So it's not just the soothing, but also if they're wanting to teach or to have their child learn something. Now, the last point that we wanted to make was, about, obviously mobile is really big. I think we all kind of know that in this room. But television is still an incredibly important part. It's still the number one thing that kids are doing when they're spending time. It's what parents choose. Definitely when they're wanting to have family time, but also the thing that parents choose when they're wanting to take up a lot of time, right? It's used more as whereas some of the mobile technologies are being used a little bit more like a pacifier, right? Television's more of a babysitter, right? So if we think about the differentiation in the way tech is being used, you have sort of mobile as a pacifier, television as a babysitter, which I think is an interesting emotional valence to think about. So television is big, and console video games. Again, so these are the console video games that are going to be played on that screen. Again, the big screen matters, right? That is the moment, that screen, whether it's the living room or the family room, that's the place where we congregate, and that's the place that has the most value from a family standpoint. Now, conversely, we don't see mobile technologies come up very much. Now, this is something we've been looking at for a long time because, the question is, well, you have a small screen, what can you do? But even with more and more asynchronous play being done on mobile devices, whether it's Trivia Crack, which is our household, or something else, we're not seeing that quite gel, right, into parents and kids thinking about mobile as family-oriented. So I think we've got some space to do that when we're trying to work in the mobile space. And of course, we're just starting to get some actual games or play on tablets themselves, which are actually multiplayer, right? Which are using multi-touch. That's a relatively new thing we're starting to see in the marketplace. So there's a lot of opportunity there to look at mobile as being more family-friendly. Now, interestingly tied, it's not just about, obviously, TV and traditional TV content, but we're also seeing that how the content is coming to the screen, all the options that parents have for content coming to the screen is also changing a little bit. So family with kids 2 to 9, and again, this is actually the other research that we were doing, but we had to put it in here because we thought it was so interesting. They over-index on subscriptions on video service at almost 200%. They're almost twice as likely to have a subscription video service, a Netflix, an Amazon Prime, a Hulu, than your average general population. Right? Now, we've heard this is the first data we had on this. We've heard this anecdotally for a couple of years. We saw the same thing with the DVR. When the DVRs came out, parents greatly over-indexed. Parents with kids greatly over-indexed. It was oh my God, I can actually create a library where I have on-demand for my kid. This is genius, right? But we're seeing this now with subscription services. And even on top of that, more families are having multiple services than are having a single service. So it's not just about, I subscribe to Netflix and that's it, right? Whether it's Netflix and I've cord cut or it's Netflix as a complement to my cable subscription. But I'm subscribing to Netflix and Hulu. I'm subscribing to Netflix and one of the more child-oriented services, right? So again, this is additional research that we're coming out with, but there's definitely something about parents sort of constantly molding that big screen experience to the content that they want for their children and actively doing it, right? Having multiple subscriptions for that. So again, coming soon on this one. I think I've made up for a lot of time that we lost earlier. But are there any questions? I know this is a very high level of the research we have, and there's a lot of data that we are sort of culling the insights, but I'd love to answer questions. Yes? Sorry, there's a mic here. I want to make sure we get the questions on the mic.
Hi, Alison.
Yeah,
I'm curious to what extent you have breakouts on the socioeconomic differences.
Yep, we do. We have, and we're happy to share that data when we release today. There wasn't much difference, right? Which we thought was, that was actually one of the things we went in looking for specifically. But when you took into consideration if they had things in the household, right? I think the difference is whether it's in the household or not, right? So there are questions we're following along. If they had it in the household, we were then asking about perceptions because if they don't have it in the household, they're not choosing between it, right? So I think that's where the difference would come. But once it's in the household, we weren't seeing a lot of difference in perception of value of context or things like that.
Alison.
Oh, hi. Hey, Renee.
Hi. I was curious about what happens to girls and whether they were getting more personal time or one-on-one time. If you're giving the boy, before he goes to bed, a game to play, let's say, is a little girl getting some cuddling, some playing? And how bad is that? So therefore, I wondered what the dynamic was as you saw it.
Absolutely right. And this, honestly, this has made us want to go do another project and with a little more qualitative to find out more about sort of the dynamics of gender around here. And in fact, it was interesting because my question was less about the girl who was like, oh, well, they're not using media, so maybe they're using something else, which might be the soothing. But it was like, oh, gosh, but the boy, right? Why are we just handing over something as opposed to trying to soothe or to, have that more interpersonal connection with the boy? So it's something that we want to dive a little bit more into. This was sort of the initial data, but I think it's a really good question for us to be asking.
Hi, over here.
Hey.
I was curious about the data where you said the parents were doing this for girls versus boys and making choices this way. What about the kids? You surveyed them as well. Are their attitudes completely different than their parents?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I actually should have said that at the very beginning. This survey was just with parents, so it was the parents and parents' perceptions of what their child would do. Sorry, I should have said that because these were younger kids. So, obviously, basically 2 to 7s, it's really hard to get that in survey data, and we were only going to 9. So we kind of decided not to get the kids. So that's an area where we want to follow up on the research to find out about the kids. We'd love to have it. That's fantastic. Okay, up there.
Hi. You had differentiated between kids' tablets and adult tablets. Did you do anything like that with TV gaming consoles? So a kid's console specifically versus maybe like a PlayStation or a Xbox? It's
a great question. We did not. We didn't look at the difference between the two of those. Again, qualitatively, that hasn't been something that's been coming up enough that we felt like, but it would be a really interesting data point to pull in. Yeah. The other thing we did not differentiate between is we didn't call out specifically a different kind of generation of e-reader, for example, right? We kind of let parents make that decision, which was a decision we made coming into it. Yeah. Yeah. Carla.
Hi, thanks. How did you define child friendliness? Was that defined by the marketing literature on the actual?
We let parents decide what child friendly meant.
So how did they define it?
It was age appropriate, meaning usability-wise, and safety. Those are the two key things that came up for child friendliness.
Okay, so that's how they chose the things for girls as opposed to...
Right. So it was the usability of it and the safety. I think safety, again, we haven't done the qualitative, so that's what we need to follow up with. But I think the safety piece was a key piece of that, certainly from the open-ended responses.
And then I had a second question, which is, do you think that the distinction between preference for tablet versus mobile has to do with what's on the mobile device now? Obviously there are many more things on tablets for kids, particularly young kids, than on mobile currently.
Well, there certainly has been more on tablet, but Again, this is where the qualitative would come in. I think it's more about things that we've heard in the past it's phone access is a big one, I think. I think, a lot of my stuff is on, especially 2 to 9-year-olds, right? This is going to be a pass back because it's, kids are just getting their own smartphones, particularly around, 9, 10, 11 now. In fact, we're seeing a little difference between smartphones and old, sort of more text phones. So I think there's certainly something about content. I think it's also parents are buying tablets, regular or child, for their kids, right? I mean, so that's more the active agency of actually buying it with the child in mind than a smartphone, which, I have it and my child wants to play it.
All right, last question over here. I just wanted to clarify this socioeconomic question. You were looking at families that had all these devices, or could they just have one device?
They could have only had, yes, it wasn't all these, I don't think there were any families that only had one.
Okay.
But they didn't have to have all these devices.
Okay, because somewhere I had heard, and maybe it was a study that was a year old, that the lower economic status families had just the smartphone. And maybe that's...
Right, well, and that's exactly right. And that's exactly what I was saying, was that if they only had a smartphone, right, then that issue of the access would change it, right? So we were getting the question after the access question, which was, okay, now if you have a smartphone, how are you using it? And what context are you using it, right?
Okay, I lied. Last question here.
Did the families include, or will you consider doing children with special needs, for example, autism?
That is a fantastic question. We didn't do any kind of screening or pull the data that way, but that's a big area that we're looking at as well.
Right. And I'd like to add one thing to the question there. The average family in the U.S., the average family, right, has 10 connected devices in their home right now, right? So there's a huge over-index, right? So, and even years ago, there's hundreds of millions of game consoles, right? And there's billions of phones, right? So you have to sort of keep that in the context of what's bubbling up. They have all these devices, multiple phones, multiple pads, sometimes it's children-specific. And yet these preferences are what's rising to the top among those literally hundreds of millions, in the U.S., if you look at that, hundreds of millions of devices.
All right, thank you guys. Welcome to answer questions in one-on-one later.